Hi, I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, Editor-in-Chief of MoneyWeek magazine. I have with me today Peter Frankopan, who's an Oxford academic and also the author of this brilliant new book, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. Now, the first and very obvious question, Peter, is why do we need a new history of the world? What's wrong with the old histories of the world?
Well, I think there's an intersection between what history means and mythologies. I think we in the West and in Western Europe and in Britain have a very clear idea of what our past looks like and what it means. And when I was at school, and my children go through the same curve, we're taught that ancient Greece produces and leads on to ancient Rome. There's then a sort of gap, the Norman conquest, we get taught that, the rise of Henry VIII multiple times, and then the Enlightenment. And there's an idea that there's a direct line that explains our rise and explains why it is that the West is the bastion of tolerances, of democracy, the global financial centres that they are, and so on. And I don't think you need to shift your perspective that much to realise that, well, first of all, there's an entire different way of looking at the past. But second, there are different regions in the world that we are perhaps more aware of today than we were when I was growing up, and perhaps even more than 100 or 200 years ago. Most of the world doesn't live in Western Europe, aren't familiar with the European languages. And, so I wrote a book really on the basis that if you're a child growing up today in Sao Paulo or Shanghai or New York or Sub-Saharan Africa or in London, what sort of things would you need to know? What is actually important in this global story we have, where these words of globalization, the idea that we're all more interconnected than we really are, what actually matters? And I'd have thought in the global sweep of history, things like the Battle of Hastings really don't matter, or the fact that Henry VIII was a bad husband, but a good king, repeatedly a bad husband. So I think that there is a way in which one can shift through to look at parts of the world that we know literally nothing about in this country. Places like Russia, obviously, and the Ukraine, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia and Iran, Central Asia through to China. And from my perspective as an academic, those regions are not just interesting because they have a history that needs to be told. It looks to me that that's where you want to stand to get a viewpoint of all of global history, because that meeting point, that sort of heart of the world, with the Silk Roads fanning out in all different directions, are where all of our great commercial exchanges have happened in history. It's where our first laws were ever made. It's where our first cities were built. Civilization itself comes from Mesopotamia. The Garden of Eden was there. And this region in the sort of heart of the world is where all of our languages collide. Indo-European meets the Semitic languages, the Altaic languages of the steppes, and Turkic meets Sino-Tibetan. It's where everything is sort of boiled up in a cauldron, and we learn from each other. And so it's where religions have bounced off each other. And even today, we do have some sort of muscle memory. We are aware, even that with being a linguistics expert, we will say that we speak Indo-European languages, and we don't really know normally what that means. Or when I fly to New York and I have to tick a box, I tick that I'm of Caucasian descent. This sort of mountain range between the Black Sea and the Caucasus. There is a kind of muscle memory that this area is perhaps more important than just a region today that looks dislocated to us. And from my perspective, having spent 30 years as a researcher and academic, it looks like you get very interesting views of how the past looks of this region and of the world that explains the rise of the West in a different way, and perhaps explains this transition period that we're going through today. So I think that the Silk Roads are interesting both as a way of looking at the past, of history in general. I think they have regional importances of explaining the history of places like Iran and Russia to those who have to make diplomatic, political and investment decisions, either with investors from these parts of the world or trying to get access to resources, minerals and so on. But then above all, trying to put the reins on our own view of the past and to distance those myths that I talked about, that comfortable story where we are more tolerant, more heroic, braver, more enlightened than other parts of the world, because it doesn't look like that from 90% of the world's perspective.
Yeah. Now we've mostly in Western Europe, we've forgotten about the Silk Roads. We've forgotten about all this area. When did it end? When did this happen? This shift from that being the centre of the world to this being the centre of the world?
Well, part of the problem is the name. So the word Silk Road evokes the exotic in all of our minds. We all think, wouldn't it be great to go to Samarkand? There must be some beautiful buildings there, and not quite sure where else. Maybe Tashkent is probably on the Silk Road, and it's sort of it's something that's very unspecific, very vague, and yet it tells us about transition of goods from east to west. That's what we think about when we talk about the Silk Road. And of course, you don't need to be a particularly sophisticated economist to realize that when there are goods traveling in one direction, you need to be asking about what's going in the other direction too. And of course, although we think of the Silk Road connecting China with Europe, most of the trade along the Silk Roads, which is a plural, it was originally coined to term in the plural, are localized. Towns that are next to each other trade, local communities trade with each other and negotiate and swap ideas and so on. But some goods, some high-value goods in particular, are making the move in both directions. So the first thing I think is to think of the Silk Roads as plural, as not just east-west, but west-east, and also north-south.
Yeah, because there are lots of different routes. People think of the Silk Road, they think of one road, but there isn't one road. There are endless different routes in many different directions.
That's right. It's a sort of web of connections, and it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder of what you include where, but it's really those ways in which that bridge works that connects the West, or Europe, North Africa, and the Gulf, through with the East, and that's quite inclusive and so on. But I think that this idea of the Silk Road as a sort of exotic past is wrong. I mean, globalization is something that worried writers in China and writers in Persia in 500 BC. The idea that the role of a good king, a good ruler of a good state, is to find the best ideas, regardless of geographical boundaries. And so those Silk Roads have been tying the world together, not just in this moment where Tamerlane's tomb was built and you have great mausolea and observatories that still stand, but it's been a constant for the last 2,500 years. And in fact, one finds these still equally useful networks today. I'm obsessed at the moment about the mirroring of railway tracks, pipelines, air routes along exactly these webs into the same sort of profile.
It's interesting. You must have seen a photograph that I've seen, a satellite photograph of Europe running down to Greece, where you can see the major economic activity today following the lines of old Roman roads. Infrastructure never leaves us, and you can see, I think, the same thing happening all over the region. You're talking about the new infrastructure following the lines of the old, and the economic activity following exactly the same lines of the routes of thousands of years ago.
And the same question then is, what's being exchanged? If mineral resources are going in one direction, let's say gas from Turkmenistan along the Tapi line to China, what comes back in the other direction? How does that affect not just the local region? What impact does that have concertinaing outwards? And who do you choose to trade with? We all, I think, take for granted in the West that highest price wins, but it doesn't always work like that, particularly when there are state players involved. And I'm talking today, the first day of Xi Jinping's visit to Great Britain, where we have a very different structure here, where we have the state and its mirror in some ways with corporations which have shareholders that may have very different interests and not be aligned with national interests, whether it's about security or about resource or about pricing or investment. China has a very different profile on these kind of megastructure considerations. But going back to the Silk Roads, that these networks have always existed, and in fact they've modified. So the goods that used to be traded, silk, spices and textiles, ceramics, have had various manifestations since then that I think we don't think about in the same way, just because we're so obsessed with this idea of silk and this exotic. But oil, the discovery in Persia in the beginning of the 20th century, the same process happened of this heart of the world fanning out, sending out black gold at that time in different directions, and who can control the sources of the commodities. Since then, again, we've got rare earths, all the things we need for our mobile phones, that 90% of which is found in China, Kazakhstan and Mongolia, sort of classic Silk Road territory. And I think that we need to detach, or it's helpful to detach from this idea of an exotic, peripheral, nice holiday mechanic to looking at the world, I suppose, like a doctor, or I'm not a medical person at all. But if someone hadn't explained to me that I had lungs and kidneys and whatever, I would assume that my body just functions because it functions. And sometimes a historian, and with a book like this, you have the opportunity to do a sort of an autopsy and to cut things open, and you can see these veins. I would have no idea that's how I can use my fingers, that my brain is connecting my movements, and that things are, that the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the bloodstream is what's keeping me alive and breathing. But the world, it's a classic thing that the ancient Greek philosophers, ancient Egyptians were obsessed about, comparing the world with the body. So in a way, it's quite an old-fashioned idea. But there are these rhythms and mechanics that one can look at, and the Silk Roads show us a very different pathology of how our connections work, and they show us a very different way of looking back at the past. For example, at how Britain and Western Europe managed to rise to colonise all these regions, because that too was about taking control of commodities, assets, and being able to dominate. And the story of how we did that looks very different, I think, when set against what you tried to control and how, rather than looking at it from the safety of London.
Yeah. Now, your final chapter in the book is about the new Silk Roads, and you finish by saying the Silk Roads are rising again. And so you're obviously seeing a shift in global power from this part of the world to that part of the world. What does it look like in 20 years?
Well, I think it's very hard to future gaze with real certainty, because there are so many variables that can dislocate. I mean, I think this time 100 years ago, the conviction in Germany, for example, was that the next 100 years were going to be the century of the Slavs and the Slavonic peoples, that rise of Russia and related areas was inexorable. The growth of the steel industries, the growth of the natural resources, the population size meant that it was inevitable that Russia would have its moment in the sunshine, and the First World War changed all of that. And I thought 15 years ago, before 9/11, a similar process looked likely, that there was this transition that was happening. We couldn't have foreseen the intervention, the heavy intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now the dislocations that's thrown out as well. So it's quite hard, I think, to really talk in the knowledge that these events might not happen, the unpredictables, where suddenly the American regime decided to, or the American government decided to actively seek regime change across multiple countries. Yeah. One wouldn't have seen that could have happened. But I think that the basic premise must be that decisions that are made today about the global economy, about financial institutions, about investment strategies, and about the geopolitical, it must be more significant what's being discussed in Moscow, Tehran, New Delhi and Mumbai, Beijing, Shanghai, and the western provinces of China. And arguably, I always burn a candle for Turkey, with its very hard hand to play, which are opportunities of, should it look west to Europe or east to the Silk Roads areas. I think that these capital cities and the political classes that control them will shape our next 2 or 3 decades, whether we like it or not, whether we don't get on with the particular individuals in question. I think it's hard towards the end of 2015, where it feels that we're at the bottom of a commodities cycle, where oil and gas have had a proper dislocation in the last 18, 24 months, to try to anticipate what will happen with those, and the other metals and so on. And so there is I think there is a bit of dancing on the graves of people in Europe, thinking, well, obviously serves Russia, Saudi, Iran, China right that they're experiencing contractions and so on. But I think that these are relatively normal in the rebirthing process, where ultimately, looking over the long term, as a long-term investor would do, you try to work out what are the assets and the commodities that actually matter to help us all grow, and who has control over those. And I suppose the great story of Europe's past is that we fundamentally don't have anything that really matters. That might be one reason why Europe's history is so ultra-violent, why we fight so much, because there's very little differential between our different countries. The things we need today, I think, like I said, rare earths, uranium,
we don't have them.
Oil, gas, so on. And it means that we have a very tricky hand to play with heavily urbanised populations, densely populated European Union, where our resource base is contracting. And over the long run, there's fat in our systems, all sorts of ways of trying to trim things out, some more painful than others. But that rising world in the East is one that we will have to engage with, and have to understand how they perceive and see us, and see their own past, I suppose. Now,
clearly this is something that the UK government is attempting to engage with. We have the Chinese visit here this week, and talks about all kinds of investments the Chinese may make in the UK, from, interestingly, prawn farming through to infrastructure and power stations. Are we doing the right thing here? Are we getting the balance right, do you think, in the way that we are connecting with China in particular?
I've written something for MoneyWeek about just that, and I think that it is a bit like a date, isn't it, where George Osborne was out in China a couple of weeks ago, talking very lavishly about Britain's relationship with China, and very much offering up all the opportunities that we might be able to bring and work on together. A sort of a plea that was earnest enough to worry Washington. Our involvement in the AIIB has raised eyebrows, but that idea that maybe Britain's special relationship with the United States is also in flux, and that Britain also, like Turkey, is looking in both directions, because we why wouldn't we? The problem is, I think, that the Chinese perceive what we're doing in Britain slightly differently, and they see the opportunities here being slightly different. So this morning on the radio I heard Philip Hammond saying, it's great the Chinese are coming here as investors, they're just after a return. In which case, if any investor's after a return, why prioritise one over another? Why make it easier for a Chinese investor than for anybody else? And if the Chinese are prepared to look for returns here and accept those, are we assuming that they want a lower return level than other investors and therefore they are better fit? Or we haven't really thought about what those returns might be. And interestingly, Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, talks of Britain's infrastructure as sort of basically like it's Victorian and falling apart. I mean, in fact, it calls Britain's standards not up to international levels.
That's entirely reasonable in some areas.
Well, having come up by train today from Oxford, there are elements of that I can also agree with. But there is that fear, I think, that what history teaches you, whether it's the British in India or the Greeks in Central Asia and in antiquity, is that first wave of investment and that first wave of co-equal trading normally, historically, trips at some point where your investor and your trading partner looks to develop a competitive edge over your local industries and your local investors that is irreversible. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I think is probably not understood by governments that have a very strong vested interest in looking for short-term wins. And that ultimately is why these great European trading empires could set up in West Africa, East Africa, in the Persian Gulf, and in India, was for the same reason, where if you can take cash up front, you're very attractive as an investor. And if the Chinese are able to do that, where we have an economic deficit here, structural needs that are to reinforce and rebuild train lines, runways, roads, as the Chinese see it, then it's very hard to turn that kind of investment down. But I think we all know, and your MoneyWeek readers more than anyone, that choosing not just your investor, but your moment for investment is absolutely critical. And I think there is a degree to which the cart can run away with the horse with these kinds of things, that because there's been a good reception in China for the first time really in 100 years, looking beyond its frontiers. It's been a very introspective century for the Chinese, very keen to make friends, mm-hmm. very keen to be seen to be a global strategist, and very keen to be a global player. It's music to China's ears when Osborne says that the Chinese should have a greater role in the IMF, for example. But those kinds of promises are very easy to give away, mm-hmm. and so I mean I'm not party to any of the discussions that are going on with the Chinese.
But you do have a sense that expectations on both sides are going to end up slightly different.
I think I do think there is a mismatch, and part of that mismatch is that our very clever civil servants and our politicians, who may or may not be equally clever, I think it's very difficult when we are reliant on a window of muscle memory that goes back 10, 20 years. We've got no concept of these great rhythms in global history. And to that extent, I suppose that Chinese visit fits alongside a much bigger reorientation of global power, where despite Russia's interventions in the Ukraine and in Syria and so on, it looks to me that there is a birthing process going on, where that rhetoric of discomfort of what the West looks like, how we talk about ourselves, how we lecture and hector and patronise, is something that does unite the Russian government of Putin with, even in its worst case, ISIS, but also Modi, in India, this sort of rejection of the things that we take absolutely for granted as being our tolerances, our freedoms of speech and so on. And increasingly these parts of the world look at Europe and say, well, it's easy for you to talk like that and to celebrate your own glories and pat yourselves on the back. But women got the vote in Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan before they did in Britain. That there was official policy of segregation in the United States only just before I was born. Homosexuality, things that we now are absolutely stamped down on, any forms of discrimination, it's brand new to us. And other people's pasts have not gone through that violence. We've learnt about religious tolerance partly through the Holocaust and the horrors of what we were able to do to each other because of our views about other people's ethnicity or their racial background or their beliefs. And other parts of the world have not had that profile of persecutions, and we don't understand that. And the problem is because we have a very eloquent media, it looks to us that these parts of the world are deeply dislocated and they're always problematic and troublesome. But actually, comparing the rhythms of warfare in Europe, where there wasn't a decade between 1350 and the Second World War, there wasn't a major war involving European powers, and this big sweep from, well, let's say Syria eastwards to China, where people have learnt how to get on much better. And part of the reason for that is that the societies in the Middle East, in the Arabic-speaking world, even in China, have tended to be more meritocratic and less hierarchical, and with much lesser inequalities. And our problem is here in Europe, that story of inequality is one that we've really struggled with from what used to be called the feudal system. Academics don't like the word feudal at the moment, in that sort of voguish way, but that top-down, that few having lots of power and those at the bottom being dispossessed and disenfranchised is something that looks very different across most of the Silk Road's area.
Peter, I think we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much. And I think, readers, we better all read this. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Merryn.
I'm anticipating that there's going to be a run on cash, that people are going to want real cash. And by real cash, I mean dollars.
You mean actual notes?
Pieces of paper.
Actual notes.
Pieces of paper, because the whole economy works on credit.